The wetlands of Chambers County stretch wide and mysterious, a maze of bayous and marshes that hold secrets in their quiet waters. It was in this tranquil yet forbidding landscape that the sheriff's office received a grim call. A body had been discovered on the marshy banks of the Trinity River. The early morning mist clung to the reeds like a shroud, concealing the marshland's secrets in its embrace. The only sound to break the heavy silence was the distant cry of a heron. For years, the Trinity River had carried stories of life and loss along its winding path, but today, its waters whispered of death. First responders navigated the muddy banks with quiet urgency, their boots sinking into the earth as they prepared for the grim task ahead. When investigators arrived at the scene, the sight was the stuff of every investigator's worst nightmare. The victim was a white female, young, lying about 150 yards from the waterline. Her dress was pulled up, and the abrasions to the throat suggested strangulation. The marks of homicide were unmistakable in this scene. With no identification, no witnesses, and no immediate leads, the unknown girl was classified as a Jane Doe, and the marshlands offered no answers, only questions. The air reeked of decaying material and damp earth, the in-our-face reminder of the tenuous boundary between life and death. Investigators worked methodically against the background of chirping crickets, voices hushed. Every detail was painstakingly recorded: torn fabric of her dress, bruises on her arms, delicate but telling abrasions around her neck. The marshes were heavy with stillness, holding their breath, it seemed, until they would finally give up their secrets. Across the bay, in the Gulf Coast town of Texas City, a family was growing desperate. 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker had gone missing earlier that day. Under her grandmother's care, Crystal had wanted to visit friends, but an argument ensued when she was told she couldn't go. Frustrated, she left the house. Hours later, she called her mother from a convenience store. Already at work, her mother berated her for the cowardice of running away and demanded that she come home. Crystal never arrived. The voice on the phone that day was laced with the belligerence of a teenager, but beneath the bravado was the desperation for contact. She was a feisty child who loved music and dreamed one day of being a singer. As the hours ticked by, the concern of her family escalated into dread. Her grandmother went over the streets, screaming her name into the night. Each unanswered scream weighed heavier in her heart. When morning finally came, the uneasy silence in their home was unbearable. Panic had begun to seep in. Crystal's mother called friends, neighbors, anyone who might have seen her daughter. That call garnered the same answer. No one knew Crystal's whereabouts. The Texas City Police Department launched an investigation into the missing persons category and slapped a bolo on "Be on the lookout," but as hours ebbed into days, their supposition was that Crystal ran away. Rebellious against her grandmother, the 13-year-old behavior seemed to play into the typical mold, but to family, the explanation just didn't quite ring so true. For the Bakers, Crystal wasn't just missing, she was out there, vulnerable, and in danger. Her mother begged police to do more, but their reassurances sounded empty. They said she's just a teenager, as if that explained it. But Crystal wasn't some runaway to them. She was a bright light, a girl whose laugh could fill a room. Their helplessness was overwhelming, but they still held on to hope and refused to accept that she was gone. Meanwhile, back in Chambers County, investigators were painstakingly processing the scene where Jane Doe had been found. Every object within a 50-foot radius was collected: a pack of cigarettes, a bottle of soda, pieces of debris. The absence of any signs of a struggle spoke volumes. She hadn't been killed here. She had been killed elsewhere and thrown in the marshes. Well planned was this crime, yet not well enough to wipe off all clues from her body. For all the attempts, though, investigators hit a brick wall. 2 weeks later, they got a call from Texas City Police. A missing girl fitted their Jane Doe. Detectives pored over maps and evidence, attempting to reconstruct what possible routes her killer might have taken. Each clue told a fragment of the story, but the picture remained incomplete. The wetlands had acted as both accomplice and witness, obscuring as much as they revealed. When the call from Texas City came, a heavy silence fell in the room. The description was a match, but the confirmation was going to be another cruel blow to an already grieving family. The worst fears of the Baker family were confirmed when they were called in to identify Crystal. Her mother sat in a room as photographs of the scene were placed before her, not the bright, carefree pictures of a teenager's life, but stark, lifeless images of how she'd been found. Among the evidence of violence, one detail stood out: the freckles on her face. There was no doubt, this was her daughter. Her mother's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. She fixed her eyes on the freckles, the remnants of her child's innocent joy now marred by the marks of violence. The room seemed to spin, every face blurred through her tears. "My baby," she whispered, the words leaden with the weight of her grief and incredulity. It was a pain that no parent should be made to bear. It was a nightmare from which there was no waking. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: ligature strangulation. Crystal's throat showed she had been choked with something other than hands, and though there was evidence that suggested sexual assault, no bodily fluids were found. Her dress and fingernail scrapings were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. But the technology of the time couldn't offer the answers investigators needed. The evidence was packed away, with hopes that someday forensic science might have an epiphany. Months went by and slowly turned into years, and the case grew cold, a tragic footnote in the annals of unsolved crimes. The fluorescent lights of the crime lab whirred above the technicians as they worked relentlessly, their tools glinting under the sterile glow. Each sample, each fragment of evidence represented an opportunity to piece together the truth, but the tools at their time could not bridge the gaps. To Crystal's family, the waiting became a cruel companion. Every phone call a jolt of hope, every silence a reminder of what they had lost. Time marched on, but the memory of that young girl, her dreams forever stolen, refused to fade. Her mother would frequently go to the spot where Crystal was found, standing in silence as if, one day, the marsh might whisper its secrets. Years later, a new sense of urgency brought life into the cold case. The Chambers County Sheriff's Office had a new administration and started reviewing cold cases. Crystal Baker's name cropped up again. Advances in DNA technology offered a glimmer of hope. Investigators resubmitted fingernail scrapings and the dress for testing. This time, they hit pay dirt. A DNA profile emerged and was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database. The breakthrough they had waited for finally came in September 2010. A match. The sheriff's office conference room hummed with a quiet but growing anticipation. The lead detective reviewed the updated lab report, the words "DNA match" leaping off the page. It was a moment of vindication, years in the making a testament to leaps that science had taken in their field. Everyone in the room felt the weight of the discovery. It wasn't just a match, it was the spark that finally might bring justice for Crystal. Investigators immediately launched into action, tracking down the man whose DNA had been left undetected for so long. It was the DNA of Kevin Edison Smith, a contractor whose place of work was near the refinery, just a short distance from where Crystal's body had been found. Smith had been arrested in Louisiana on unrelated drug charges. His DNA, as part of the routine booking process, had been entered into CODIS and directly linked him with Crystal's murder. After 14 years of angst and question marks, the case was back on track. The connection was chilling. Kevin Edison Smith was a name, yes, but Kevin Edison Smith also represented real, tangible flesh and blood, a reminder of the horrors that unfolded. Investigators stitched together his life, his movements, his job history, and the proximity he held to Crystal's last known location. The news sent shockwaves across Chambers County and Texas City, with murmurs of the arrest filtering in a great hurry. For Crystal's family, it would prove a bittersweet revelation. They had longed for answers, but knowing who had taken her from them brought fresh waves of grief. And a bittersweet relief. The family of Crystal saw authorities arrange Smith's extradition to Texas on charges of capital murder. The evidence was overwhelming as he went to trial. DNA from Crystal's fingernails placed him at the scene, and testimony about his movements in 1996 placed him in the area around the time of her disappearance. Confronted with the mountain of evidence, Smith made a surprise offer. He would confess if prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. For Crystal's family, the confession offered something a trial alone could not: closure. News of Smith's confession reached Crystal's family, and they reacted to the news with a host of mixed emotions. Relief for resolution wrestled with anger. Who did he think he was, playing bargain poker with the life he'd ruined? Her mother was there every day in the courtroom, staring at the man who took away her daughter's future. She listened as prosecutors laid bare the details of his crimes, and though every word was a knife to her heart, she showed no emotion. Though it hurt, the confession did bring a certain closure. The long nightmare was slowly coming to an end. Smith confessed to strangling Crystal, but he said it had been an accident. His story only seemed to fill in the colors of a cool predator masking crimes as accidents. The jury wasn't buying it. They went into deliberation for 30 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty with the charge of capital murder. Smith was condemned to life imprisonment without parole. The sentence was read, and the courtroom went silent, the weight of the jury's decision settling upon all present. Crystal's mother sat tight-lipped, her hands clenched in her lap, with tears running profusely down her face. Justice was served, but that void left by the absence of her daughter could not be filled by any sentence. Smith didn't show much emotion when the sentence was pronounced, but his fate was sealed. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again to harm another child, never again to silence another family with his cruelty. While justice was served, Crystal's mother had already made up her mind that her daughter's legacy needed to go beyond the courtroom. Her advocacy led to the passage of the Crystal Baker Law in Texas, expanding the crimes requiring DNA collection from arrestees. Since its implementation in 2019, the law has helped solve hundreds of cold cases, bringing closure to families who, like the Bakers, had lived in the shadow of unanswered questions. Crystal's mother became an uncompromising agent of change, molding her grief into action. She took her case to every corner of the state, speaking to every lawmaker, community leader, and person who would lend an ear. Her voice, which once chocked with tears, became a battle cry for justice. The Crystal Baker Law wasn't just legislation, but a promise that no family would ever be left in the dark or any victim forgotten. It was a victory for each family still seeking answers, and a beacon of hope in an often unforgiving world of criminal justice. Crystal Jane Baker's story is one of heartbreak, perseverance, and justice. Her life was cut short, but her legacy remains alive and well, testament to the strength of determination and relentless pursuit of the truth. In Texas City, Crystal's mural now adorns the side of a community center, her bright smile forever frozen in paint. Every year, candlelight vigils light up the night in her name, as families come together to share their stories of loss and hope. Crystal's name reverberates through the corridors of justice, a reminder that from the darkest tragedies, light may emerge. But it's not a cautionary tale. Rather, it's proof that through persistence, a family and an entire community were set on seeing that justice would prevail. Crystal Jane Baker's tragedy has become a story of heartbreak into a powerful symbol for hope and resiliency. Cut down by unspeakable violence, her life became a catalyst for change. Proof that even in the face of unimaginable pain, a family's love and determination could reshape the future. Her name now stands as a beacon for justice, etched into legislation and woven into the lives of families who no longer have to walk their journey of grief alone. Besides bringing perpetrators to account, the Crystal Baker Law literally brought to life hundreds of cold cases that had lain silent. The ripples of change changed a system that moved much too slowly, and gave families the means to fight for answers so long overdue. Each match in the DNA database, each solved case, serves as a testament to Crystal's enduring legacy, a legacy born not just of tragedy, but of triumph. Crystal's family found their voice in the face of overwhelming loss, and their courage inspired others to do the same. Her story lives on in classrooms, courts, and community centers, a reminder that justice, though often delayed, is not beyond reach. She is more than a victim. She is a symbol of perseverance, the girl whose freckles and smile could not be erased by time or tragedy. While the wetlands of Chambers County still stretch wide and mysterious, no longer do they whisper only of secrets. In the echoes of Crystal's story, they speak of courage of change, of a mother's unstoppable power to bring light into even the most dark of places. Crystal Jean Baker will never be forgotten, from the annals of justice down to the hearts of those who carry on the quest for what is right. It was a crisp, cool morning in Lafayette, Louisiana, that Saturday, December 6, 2008. The Cajun Country Marathon was in progress, a very unusual marathon because of its road and off-road paths through the woods of the region. The festive atmosphere created by runners and spectators alike was disrupted when a terrible discovery brought the race to an abrupt halt. A participant, warming up before the marathon, stepped off the trail into the woods for a moment of privacy. Just 20 yards from the roadside, he stumbled upon something no one should ever have to see. A lifeless body lay in the undergrowth, a woman, unmistakably deceased, surrounded by a pool of blood. The runner quickly notified nearby off-duty sheriff's deputies stationed to ensure the race's safety. Sergeant Joe Bajar, an 8-year veteran of the force, was among the first to respond. The scene he encountered would haunt him for years to come. The victim, a white female in her mid-40s, lay on her back, her arms positioned above her head. Her clothing was intact, though her pants were unbuttoned, and her throat bore the unmistakable signs of a violent assault, deep, jagged cuts, multiple. Blood soaked the ground, painting a grisly picture of what had transpired. Despite the brutality, investigators noted that there was no evidence of sexual assault. The lack of decomposition, along with the absence of any animal interference common in Louisiana's humid climate, suggested the body had not been there long. Yet there were no personal belongings, no purse, no ID. Just one clue was found in her pocket, a room key for the Regency Inn, a motel 5 miles away. Detectives wasted no time. At the Regency Inn, they learned the key belonged to room 46, which had been occupied by a woman identified as Bonnie Wirt, 47, of Illinois. A friend traveling with Bonnie told investigators she had not returned the night before. Fingerprints from the victim confirmed it. Bonnie Wirt was the woman found in the woods. Bonnie wasn't a local. She had traveled from Illinois as part of a transient group. Sharing her motel room was a man named Lambert Hatfield, someone Bonnie had described to her daughter as a romantic partner. Their relationship, however, was anything but stable. Police soon uncovered a history of domestic violence between Bonnie and Lambert. Months earlier, in another state, Lambert had been arrested after striking Bonnie during a drunken altercation. That incident had led her to seek refuge in a women's shelter and file a restraining order. Yet somehow she had ended up back with him, traveling through the South, a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. When questioned, Lambert claimed he had last seen Bonnie the morning before her death. He said she was asleep in their motel room when he left for work. According to Lambert, Bonnie often disappeared for hours or days, sometimes engaging in sex work to support her drug habit. Lambert denied any involvement in her murder, and a thorough search of his belongings and clothing turned up no evidence tying him to the crime. Still, investigators remained suspicious. They examined his shoes, hoping the treads might match impressions at the crime scene, but they found nothing conclusive. Without physical evidence or signs of injury on Lambert, detectives couldn't justify holding him. On December 8, 2008, Bonnie's autopsy told more about her last moments. The results depicted a vicious, drawn-out attack. She had been stabbed 11 times in the back and shoulders, bludgeoned in the head with a blunt object, and her throat had been slashed 6 times. Defensive wounds on her arms and the skin found under her fingernails suggested she had fought valiantly against her attacker. In the days that followed, detectives sent blood swabs and nail scrapings to the crime lab, desperate for answers. 10 days later, the results came in. Among the samples was a full DNA profile, a white male. While this was a breakthrough, it was bittersweet. When the DNA was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal Database, it failed to match any existing records. The suspect remained unidentified. With no other leads, the case grew colder by the day. Sergeant Bajar and his team pursued every tip and exhausted every avenue. After a year, they had no choice but to suspend the investigation, leaving Bonnie's family to grieve without closure. Despite the case being shelved, hope lingered in the form of DNA. The crime lab continued running the sample through CODIS, waiting for a match. Then, in 2013, 5 years after the murder, a sharp-eyed technician noticed something unusual. The DNA contained a distinctive familial trait on the Y chromosome, a trait associated with a local family line, the AAR family. While it wasn't a direct match, the discovery provided a critical lead. Investigators now had a potential surname for their suspect. Sergeant Bajar, now part of the Homicide and Violent Crime Section, was determined to crack the case. Over the next several years, he methodically collected voluntary DNA samples from male members of the AAR family, cross-referencing them against the suspect's profile. But each test came back negative. Then, in March 2018, nearly a decade after Bonnie's murder, the case took a dramatic turn. While building a shed in his backyard, Sergeant Bajar received an unexpected phone call from the crime lab. The technician on the other end was almost breathless with excitement. They had a match. The suspect, Miller AAR, had been arrested on a drug charge. During the booking process, his DNA was collected and uploaded to the database. It matched the DNA found on Bonnie's body. Miller AAR was brought in for questioning. Confronted with the evidence, he didn't hesitate. Within seconds, he confessed. His voice trembled as he recounted the events of that fateful night. "I picked her up on Cameron Street," he said. "She needed a ride, so I offered one." But the meeting quickly turned ugly. Miller said Bonnie wanted money for sex, and an argument ensued. The fight got worse. Miller said he attacked Bonnie in a rage. He strangled her and, in his words, freaked out. Panicked, he stabbed her repeatedly, trying to quiet her screams and end the fight. Miller AAR pled guilty to manslaughter. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a punishment that brought some measure of justice, though it could never undo the pain he had caused. As he sat in court, Miller appeared remorseful. He acknowledged the brutality of his actions, expressing disgust at what he had done. For Bonnie's family, his confession provided answers but no solace. The wounds of her loss, though scabbed over with time, would never fully heal. 10 years had passed since that December morning in the woods of Lafayette, a decade marked by grief, frustration, and relentless determination. Bonnie Roert's story is a sobering reminder of the violence that can lurk in the shadows, but it is also a testament to the power of perseverance and the unyielding pursuit of justice. For Sergeant Bajar and the team that worked tirelessly on Bonnie's case, the resolution was bittersweet. They had fulfilled their duty, but the cost was steep, a life cut short, a family forever changed, and a community left to ponder the darkness that had briefly touched their world. As Miller AAR settled into the bleak confines of his prison sentence, the details of his life and his path to violence began to emerge. His confession had closed a chapter, but for detectives, the search for understanding never truly ends. Every killer has a story, a series of decisions, circumstances, and impulses that lead them to a moment of irreversible horror. Miller, AAR, was no exception. having an as mundane as troubled past. He had been born and raised in the bayous of Louisiana and had spent most of his life at the periphery of society. His community knew him to be a drifter, one who had difficulties in holding a job, maintaining addiction-free lifestyles, and interacting well with others. The family name, AAR, was a common one in the region, and while it carried some respect among older generations, Miller had tarnished it with a series of minor offenses. His rap sheet before Bonnie's murder included petty theft, public intoxication, and a handful of drug-related charges. These were the marks of a man spiraling, a man whose life had been dominated by chaos and instability. But those closest to him insisted he wasn't a violent man. Miller's family interviewed described a man with many flaws who was often too generous. His mother, now elderly and frail, described him as a boy who was always quick to lend a helping hand. His sister recalled him as a protective older sibling, someone who would step in to defend her if she was teased at school. But somewhere along the way, the man she knew had been consumed by addiction, resentment, and a deep-seated anger he could no longer control. The forensic evidence from Bonnie's murder showed the extent to which that anger had become brutal. Investigators revisited the autopsy, as well as reports of the crime scene, piecing together how it happened to be that exactly. Deeply cut marks in her back showed Bonnie was under prolonged attack. Therefore, this killing was driven by an urge rather than a calculated process. Slashes to her neck were chaotic, desperate, but chilling evidence that Miller was under a frenzied attack. But why Bonnie? Why that night? Miller's confession offered some clues, but the truth was more complex. His admission that the encounter began as a dispute over money for sex provided a motive, but it didn't fully explain the level of violence. Detectives believed that Bonnie may have reminded Miller of someone in his past, a person who had hurt or rejected him. The rage he unleashed on her was disproportionate, almost personal, despite them being strangers. For Bonnie's family, the resolution of the case brought answers, but not peace. Her daughter, Emily, had been just a teenager when her mother was killed. Now, a grown woman, she carried the scars of her loss like invisible weights. She remembered her mother as a boisterous, loving woman who had been dealt a tough hand in life. Bonnie's struggles with addiction and unstable relationships had made her vulnerable, but they didn't define her. She was also a devoted mother, someone who would do anything to make her daughter smile. As Emily read through the case files years later, she found herself grappling with a mix of emotions: anger at Miller, sadness for the life her mother had lost, and frustration at the system that had failed to protect her. Bonnie's journey to Louisiana had been fueled by hope, a chance to start over, to escape the shadows of her past. Instead, it had led her into the path of a killer. Emily quickly emerged as a crusader for victims of violent crime, using her mother's story to draw attention to what women in these kinds of situations could expect. She addressed schools, community centers, and support groups, pleading with people to break the cycles of violence and addiction before they could take more lives. For Sergeant Bajar, the case of Bonnie is a point at which everything turns around for his career. In order to crack it had needed years of hard work, cooperation, and confidence in this relatively new science that was called DNA analysis. This meant never to lose hope and leave the case for the cold trail. But the case also left him with lingering questions. Could they have done more to find Miller sooner? Were there signs they had missed? Clues that might have cracked the case earlier? These were the questions that haunted detectives long after the headlines faded. Bajar often reflected on the role of technology in solving Bonnie's case. Familial DNA testing, which had provided the critical breakthrough, was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations. It opened the door to solving countless other cold cases, but it also raised ethical questions about privacy and consent. Bonnie's case became a landmark in Louisiana's approach to cold case investigations. It underlined the need to keep unsolved cases active in databases and to continually review evidence with new techniques. Her story reminded people that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never entirely out of reach. The community of Lafayette, still troubled by the sheer brutality of this crime, found new solace in the closure of the case. Bonnie's story inspired leaders in that local community to mobilize stronger support systems for those victims of domestic violence and addiction. Programs designed to find at-risk women were established, targeting them to avoid falling through cracks before stability is achieved. Behind bars, Miller AAR confronted the gravity of his actions. He attended counseling sessions and took part in a restorative justice program, where he listened to the stories of other inmates and their victims. Those who worked with him noted a change, a man who seemed genuinely remorseful, burdened by guilt, and desperate to make amends. But for Bonnie's family, forgiveness was a distant concept. Emily visited him once, not for closure, but for answers. She wanted to know why he had done it, why her mother. The meeting was tense, emotional, and ultimately unsatisfying. Miller apologized profusely, but his explanations felt hollow. "I can never forgive him," Emily said afterward, "but I can try to move forward. For my mother, for myself." Bonnie Rurt's murder was a senseless act of violence, but her story did not end there. It became a catalyst for change, a rallying cry for justice, and a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. For those who knew her, Bonnie went far beyond being the victim of a crime. She was a mother, a friend, and a fighter, though her life was decidedly short. The legacy lives on, however, in the hearts of those closest to her, in the breakthroughs her case inspired, and in the continued fight to make sure no one else suffers the same fate. The bayous of Louisiana may hold their secrets, but Bonnie's story will never be forgotten. It's a testament to the determination of those who seek justice, the power of science to uncover the truth, and the enduring hope that even in the darkest of times, light can be found.